I'm Nora Vale, and for most of my life, I knew exactly what it felt like to be the least impressive person in the room. In my family, value was measured in polished shoes, expensive watches, and how many people stood up when you walked in. My stepfather, Vincent Vale, built a luxury hotel empire all across the Gulf Coast, and he carried himself like every chandelier in every ballroom he owned had been hung personally for his glory. My mother, Celeste, loved that world even more than he did. She loved appearances, legacy, influence, and the kind of social standing that made people smile too quickly and laugh too loudly at her jokes. My younger brother, Griffin, had been raised as the heir to all of it. He was handsome, confident, and so certain of his own importance that even at family dinners he spoke like he was already chairing a board meeting. Then there was me. I was the daughter who became an emergency room nurse instead of an executive. The one who wore scrubs instead of designer dresses. The one who came home smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion instead of expensive cologne and private dining rooms. My family talked about Griffin like he was the future, and about me like I was a phase they kept hoping I'd outgrow. I spent years pretending it didn't hurt as much as it did. At every birthday dinner, every holiday gathering, every polished event at one of Vincent's hotels, the same pattern repeated itself. Griffin would announce some new deal, some property expansion, some investor he had charmed, and everyone would lean in like he was revealing state secrets. My mother would glow, Vincent would clap him on the shoulder, and the whole table would hum with approval. Then someone would eventually turn to me, usually as an afterthought, and ask how the hospital was going in the same tone people use when asking about bad weather. They hope passes soon. If I talked about a patient I couldn't stop thinking about, or a brutal overnight shift, or the quiet victories that kept me going, their eyes would glaze over. In their world, saving lives was admirable, only in the abstract. It didn't carry the glamour of ownership, power, or money. I learned early that compassion impressed strangers more than it impressed my own family. So I stopped expecting applause. I told myself it was enough to know my work mattered, even if the people closest to me acted like it was a detour from the life I should have wanted. Then, one rainy Tuesday night, everything shifted in the most ordinary way possible. I was 28, halfway through a miserable double shift at University Medical Center, and I had stepped outside under the awning for 6 minutes of air and silence. My feet were throbbing, my head ached, and I was mentally preparing myself to go back inside to another waiting room full of need. That was when I saw him. A man in a dark coat was kneeling in the rain beside an elderly street musician whose wheelchair wheel had gotten jammed in a storm drain. People were hurrying past with umbrellas, pretending not to notice, but he was right there in the downpour, sleeves soaked, talking to the old man with a kind of calm that made the whole scene feel less chaotic. I ran over to help without thinking. Between the two of us, we got the wheelchair loose and helped the musician under shelter. The stranger thanked me like I had done something heroic, which was funny, because he was the one who had stopped in the first place. He had kind eyes, a quiet voice, and none of the frantic self-importance I was used to seeing in men with money. When I asked his name, he said, Ezra. When I asked what he did, he smiled and said, logistics. That was it. No speech, no bragging, no effort to impress me. Strangely, that made me want to know him more. After that night, we kept finding our way back to each other. Sometimes it was late coffee after my shift. Sometimes it was a walk along the river when I had a rare day off. Sometimes it was just sitting together in silence, which somehow never felt awkward with him. Ezra had this way of listening that made me feel like my words didn't have to fight for oxygen. He remembered details no one else remembered. He asked about my patients, my coworkers, the things that scared me, the things that made me stay in a job that drained me as much as it fulfilled me. He never once talked down to me, never once acted like my life was smaller than his. And because I was so unused to that, I felt myself falling for him before I was ready to admit it. He was older than me by several years, composed in a way that made most people seem noisy, and private without seeming cold. There was a steadiness about him that made me feel safe. Not dazzled. Safe. In my family, everything had always been about performance. Ezra felt like the opposite of that. He felt real. Of course, the minute I introduced him to my family, they tried to turn him into a problem. My mother's very first question was not whether he made me happy. It was, logistics for what? Vincent wanted to know what kind of car he drove. Griffin smirked through their first dinner and made little comments disguised as jokes, the kind meant to test whether Ezra would be easy to embarrass. But Ezra never took the bait. He sat at our table, calm and polite, and answered every question with the kind of self-possession that only irritated them more. They were used to men puffing themselves up in front of them, desperate for approval or intimidated by money. Ezra did neither. He didn't challenge them, but he didn't perform for them either. After dinner, Griffin cornered me in the kitchen and said, "He seems fine, Nora, but I can't tell if he's confident or if he just doesn't realize he's out of his league." I remember looking past him to where Ezra was helping clear plates without being asked, and something inside me hardened. For once, I didn't care what my family thought, or at least I wanted to believe I didn't. What I knew was this: when I was with Ezra, I didn't feel like the disappointing daughter, the less successful sibling, the woman whose worth had to be defended. I just felt like myself. And after years of being measured against standards I never believed in, that feeling was powerful enough to change everything. I didn't know then how much my family would underestimate him. I didn't know how much they would underestimate me. I only knew that for the first time in my life, I had met someone who saw me clearly, and I was beginning to understand how dangerous that kind of love could be, to people who had spent years benefiting from my silence. After Ezra and I got married, I kept telling myself things would settle down. I thought maybe once my family saw that he wasn't temporary, that he wasn't some passing rebellion or phase I would outgrow, they would adjust. They didn't. If anything, their contempt became more polished, more efficient. It stopped sounding like open disapproval and started sounding like concern, humor, or advice, which somehow made it worse. My mother would tilt her head and ask whether I was tired of those exhausting night shifts yet. The same way someone might ask whether I was tired of a childish hobby. Vincent would mention openings in guest relations or community outreach at one of the hotels, as though my nursing career were a rough draft of the respectable life they were still willing to offer me. Griffin, of course, didn't even bother pretending. He made little comments whenever Ezra and I were around, never enough to cause a real scene, always just enough to remind me that in his mind he was still the standard, and the rest of us were orbiting him. He had a talent for making cruelty sound casual. "Nora likes fixer-upper lives," he said once over dinner when someone asked how I was doing. "First the ER, now logistics." Everyone laughed except Ezra and me, and I remember staring down at my plate, feeling that old familiar heat rise in my chest, the heat of wanting to defend myself, and being so tired of needing to. What made it harder was that Ezra never gave them anything to grab onto. He didn't brag, didn't retaliate, didn't try to outshine them in their own arena. He was steady in a way that made their noise look childish, but I don't think they understood that. They mistook restraint for weakness, because that was the only way their worldview made sense. In their world, if you had power, you displayed it. You let it enter the room before you did. You made sure your watch, your title, your opinions, your stories, your seating arrangement all announced your place in the hierarchy. Ezra did none of that. He was private, measured, and impossible to impress, and instead of recognizing that as confidence, they read it as insignificance. I saw the shift happen over and over. Someone would meet him, assume he was ordinary, speak to him with mild condescension, and then become strangely unsettled when he didn't scramble to correct them. At family events, I would watch people turn away from him too quickly, as though they had already solved him and found him lacking. Meanwhile, he would ask the caterer's assistant how long she'd been working there, or help an older guest find a quieter seat, or stand beside me in perfect silence when he could tell I was counting the minutes until we could leave. He never needed attention to feel solid. I think that was one of the things I loved most about him, and one of the things my family hated without even understanding why. Still, I kept asking him to let it go. I told myself I was protecting the fragile peace that existed only because I absorbed every insult before it could become a conflict. Whenever Griffin said something smug, whenever my mother reduced my life to a disappointing footnote, whenever Vincent spoke to Ezra like he was a polite inconvenience, I would squeeze Ezra's hand under the table or catch his eye across the room, silently asking him not to respond. And he honored that, every single time. He did it because he loved me, not because he accepted their behavior. But love is not the same thing as agreement, and over the years I started to see the cost of my silence written all over him. Not resentment exactly, but sadness, disappointment. The look of a man watching someone he loved make herself smaller in order to survive rooms that should never have required that from her in the first place. One night after a particularly awful Christmas dinner, when Griffin joked that I probably got more emotional satisfaction from a trauma ward than I ever would from real success. We got home and I found Ezra standing in the kitchen with both hands braced on the counter, staring out the window into the dark. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said quietly. "Doing what?" I asked, though I knew. He turned and looked at me, and there was no anger in his face, which somehow made it harder. "Offering yourself up to people who enjoy cutting you down." I wanted to tell him it wasn't that simple, that they were my family, that history isn't something you can switch off like a lamp. But the truth was, part of me still believed that if I just loved them enough, if I stayed patient enough, if I refused to make things worse, eventually they would meet me halfway. Ezra saw that belief for what it was long before I did. "Peace built on your humiliation isn't peace, Nora," he said. "It's just a prettier form of surrender." Everything kept building anyway, and by the time the Crescent Crown Gala approached, I already felt the tension humming beneath my skin. The event was always one of the biggest nights in Vincent's social calendar, but this year it was even worse because it doubled as Griffin's engagement celebration. One giant, polished monument to everything my family valued most. Money, status, visibility, and the chance to be admired by a room full of people who collected each other's importance like trophies. When the invitation arrived, it was addressed to Ms. Noravelle and guest, and I just sat there at my kitchen table staring at those words until I laughed out loud. Guest. Not Ezra Cole, not my husband, not even Mr. Cole. Just guest. Like he was an interchangeable plus one who happened to occupy a seat if enough room remained after the important people were accounted for. I almost threw the invitation away. I should have. But then my mother called and made it sound mandatory, not because she wanted me there, but because absence would be noticed. "This is a family night," she said, and I nearly asked since when. Instead, I listened while she reminded me to dress appropriately, to be pleasant, and in the most revealing line of all, to make sure Ezra kept a low profile, because there would be major investors in attendance. A low profile. As if my husband were a risk to be managed rather than a person to be welcomed. When I hung up, I felt that same exhausted ache I always felt after talking to her. The ache of being treated like a public relations issue instead of a daughter. The night of the gala, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror in a dark green dress I hadn't worn in years, and watched Ezra knot his tie with that same calm, unhurried precision he brought to everything. He looked composed, maybe more than usual, and I noticed him slipping a folded document into the inside pocket of his jacket. "What's that?" I asked. He glanced at me in the mirror. "Something I may need later." There was no drama in his voice, but there was finality, and for a second something cold moved through me. "Ezra," I said, "what does that mean?" He turned then, stepped closer, and adjusted one of my earrings with such tenderness that it almost undid me. "It means I'm going because you asked me to," he said, "but I'm not going to help them humiliate you anymore." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized the night already carried a weight I hadn't wanted to name. My family thought the gala would be another chance to showcase Griffin, celebrate themselves, and tuck me politely into the background. But standing there in our room, watching my husband smooth his jacket over whatever he had placed in that pocket, I had the sudden, unmistakable feeling that something was about to break. And this time, it wouldn't be me. By the time Ezra and I walked into the Crescent Crown Gala, I already knew exactly where the night was heading, even if I didn't yet know how far it would go. The St. Adrien Hotel looked like the kind of place my family worshipped. All polished marble, crystal chandeliers, towering white floral arrangements, and staff trained to move like elegance itself had hired them. Everything gleamed. Everything whispered money. My mother stood near the entrance in a silver gown, greeting donors and investors as though she personally owned the moonlight spilling through the windows. Vincent was across the ballroom laughing too loudly at something a developer from Baton Rouge had said. Griffin stood near the stage with Sloane, his fiancée, both of them lit by admiration and camera flashes. Ezra's hand rested lightly against my back as we stepped inside, and I felt every old instinct in me rise at once. Stand straight, smile softly, take up less room, get through it. My mother air-kissed my cheek and barely looked at Ezra before telling us our table number. 19, she said, with a smile so smooth it almost disguised the insult. We had to rearrange things for some very important guests. Of course she did. Table 19 wasn't near the rear terrace like she claimed. It was tucked behind an oversized arrangement of white orchids near the service corridor, half hidden from the stage and close enough to the swinging doors that I could hear silverware being sorted in the kitchen. I stared at the table for a full second before sitting down, and Ezra, after pulling out my chair, took his own seat with a calm expression that somehow made the whole setup feel even more ridiculous. From where we sat, I had a perfect view of the hierarchy. Griffin and Sloane at the front, surrounded by people who mattered. Vincent circulating among investors with one hand in his pocket and the other gesturing like he was conducting the whole room. My mother floating from table to table, making sure the right people felt seen. And then me, half blocked by flowers, close enough to hear the speeches, but far enough to be forgotten in every photo. That had always been my place in the family. Visible enough to be judged, never important enough to be centered. The orchestra played softly, while waiters drifted by with trays of champagne, and one of Griffin's friends stopped at our table long enough to grin at Ezra and say, "You two got the quiet corner, huh?" Probably better for networking your kind of crowd. He laughed before I could even respond, as if his own joke had saved us all from the burden of conversation. I felt my jaw tighten, but Ezra just thanked the waiter for the water and said nothing. It should have comforted me, that composure of his, but instead it made me anxious, because by then I knew his silence no longer meant acceptance. It meant measurement. It meant he was letting the night reveal itself fully before deciding what to do with it. The speeches began after dinner, right on schedule, because nothing in my stepfather's world was ever allowed to appear accidental. Vincent took the stage first to applause that started before he even reached the microphone. He stood there beneath the lights, smiling like a man greeting his own legend, and launched into a speech about vision, growth, discipline, and the future of Vale hospitality. He praised Griffin for his leadership, his instincts, his natural understanding of power, which made a few people laugh admiringly as if arrogance were an inherited talent. He called Sloane the perfect addition to the family. He spoke about legacy the way priests speak about salvation. Then, because there always had to be contrast, he mentioned me. "And Nora," he said, glancing toward the back of the room with that patronizing smile I had known since childhood, "has always chosen a more personal version of service." A few people chuckled. He nodded, as though indulging a minor disappointment had become one of his finer qualities. Not all contributions are made in boardrooms, I suppose. More laughter. Soft, polished, cruel. My face burned, but I kept it still. I had trained myself over years not to react in rooms like that, because any emotion would only be treated as proof that I was too fragile for their world. Then my mother took the microphone, and somehow that hurt more. Vincent liked to humiliate through hierarchy, but my mother preferred performance. She looked radiant under the lights, one hand wrapped around a champagne flute, her smile warm enough to fool anyone who didn't know what lived underneath it. "We are so proud of both our children," she began. Griffin, of course, was born for a room like this. He understands excellence. She turned slightly, looking out over the guests as cameras flashed. "And Nora has always had such a tender heart. She was never ambitious in the traditional sense, but every family has someone who is good at cleaning up messes." The room laughed again. I actually heard it ripple this time, felt it move over my skin like heat. My mother raised her glass a little higher. "And Ezra," she added, finally glancing in our direction, "has fit in exactly as expected. Quiet, agreeable, never in the way. Honestly, for a woman working exhausting hospital shifts, what more could one want in a husband?" That got the biggest laugh of all. I stared at her across the ballroom and felt something in me go absolutely still. I had spent so many years bracing for their cruelty, interpreting it, softening it, telling myself they didn't really mean it the way it sounded. But there was no softer version of that moment. My own mother had turned my life into a punchline in front of hundreds of people, and everyone important to her had rewarded her for it. Ezra took one sip of water, set down the glass, and stood up. I looked at him so fast my chair nearly scraped the floor. "Ezra," I whispered, but he didn't look at me. He was already walking toward the stage with the kind of measured calm that makes everyone else's panic seem amateur. At first, only a few people noticed. Then more heads turned. The laughter died in pieces. Griffin frowned. My mother's smile faltered. Vincent stepped slightly away from the podium, annoyed more than alarmed. Ezra stopped just below the stage and looked up at them. "Can I help you?" Vincent asked, the microphone still in his hand. Ezra's voice, when he answered, was not loud, but it carried. "You could have," he said, "a long time ago." The room went silent. My mother recovered first, of course. "Ezra," she said with a strained laugh, "now really isn't the time." He looked at her and replied, "It became the time when you made my wife the entertainment." I felt every eye in the ballroom swing toward me and then back to him. Griffin moved closer, jaw tight, already trying to regain control. "Take this somewhere private," he snapped. Ezra didn't even glance at him right away. "Your family has never insulted Nora in private," he said. "Why should I respond that way?" And then he stepped onto the stage. He took the microphone from Vincent with a calmness so complete it felt like its own form of authority. "My name is Ezra Cole," he said, looking out over the room, "and for the last 5 years I have listened to this family belittle my wife's career, mock her compassion, and mistake her grace for weakness." No one moved. No one even pretended to. Nora spends her nights doing the kind of work that keeps other people alive long enough to return to rooms like this. She has more courage in one shift than most of us will ever have to summon in our entire lives. My throat tightened so suddenly it hurt. Vincent tried to interrupt then, some half-formed protest about this being neither appropriate nor necessary, but Ezra kept going with that same level, unshaken tone. "I've let you assume whatever made you comfortable about me," he said. "You heard the word logistics and decided you knew my worth. That was your mistake." Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded document I had seen earlier that evening. 12 years ago," he said, unfolding it slowly, "I founded Meridian Grid." A murmur ran through the room, then another, then a sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the front. I watched recognition spread across faces one by one like a fuse catching fire. "Meridian Grid," he repeated, "designs emergency supply systems, hospital response networks, and disaster distribution operations across the Gulf region." The ballroom had changed completely now. No laughter, no smirks, just shock. "And tonight," Ezra said, holding up the document, "I'm announcing a $10 million emergency training and trauma support initiative for public hospitals across southeast Louisiana. The first hospital selected for the pilot program is University Medical Center." My hospital. My chest clenched so hard I had to grip the back of my chair. Then he looked at me, right there in front of everyone, and said the words that undid me completely. "This program exists because I watched Nora do work the world depends on, and her family dismiss it anyway. She inspired every part of it." And in that moment, with the whole glittering room stunned into silence, I realized the night had finally broken open, and this time the true's the thing everyone would have to look at. I don't remember deciding to stand. 1 second I was gripping the back of my chair so hard my fingers hurt, and the next I was moving through the parted crowd toward the stage, tears hot on my face and 200 silent people watching me like I had become the center of a story they suddenly understood they'd misread. Ezra stepped back the moment he saw me coming, not to disappear, but to make room for me. And that mattered more than anyone in that ballroom probably realized. My whole life, people in my family had spoken over me, for me, about me, as if I were too soft to carry my own truth. But Ezra didn't rescue me. He stood beside me and let me speak. I took the microphone with shaking hands and looked out at the room. My mother was frozen, one hand still wrapped around her champagne glass. Vincent's jaw had gone rigid in that way it always did when he was furious, but trying to look composed. Griffin looked less angry than stunned, as though the universe had violated some private rule by allowing this moment to happen at all. For one heartbeat, I thought I might lose my nerve. Then I heard my mother's laugh in my head, the one that had followed her joke about me cleaning up messes, and something inside me hardened into clarity. "My name is Nora Vale," I said. And even to me my voice sounded different, steadier than I felt. And for most of my life I have been told, directly and indirectly, that I should be grateful to be tolerated in rooms like this. No one moved. I was taught that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, forgave enough, eventually my family would respect me. But respect that depends on status isn't respect, it's vanity. I looked directly at Vincent then. "You mocked my work because it doesn't produce headlines or ribbon cuttings. You treated my life like a lesser version of Griffin's because I chose service over prestige." Then I turned to my mother. "And you made a joke out of me in front of this entire room because you thought I would do what I always do, smile tightly, sit down, and absorb it." My throat tightened, but I kept going. "If Ezra had been exactly who you assumed he was, an ordinary man with an ordinary job, the way you treated him would still have been cruel. The way you treated me would still have been cruel. The fact that you only look ashamed now that you know what he built, proves that you do understand worth. You just only recognize it when it flatters you." There was a silence after that so complete it felt almost physical. I could hear the faint clink of glassware from the back of the ballroom, the rustle of someone shifting in their seat, the low hum of the air conditioning overhead. Then Griffin stepped forward, because of course he did. He had never once in his life let a moment go by if he thought he could drag it back under his control. "This is unbelievable," he snapped. "You're doing this at our family event?" I turned to him, and for the first time in years I didn't feel that old instinct to soften my answer. "No," I said. "You did this. You all did. I'm just refusing to carry it quietly anymore." He looked like I had slapped him. Vincent tried next, his voice clipped, careful, already reaching for the language of damage control. "Nora, emotions are high. We can discuss this privately as a family." I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving laugh that seemed to startle the room even more than my speech had. "A family?" I repeated. "Families don't hide you behind floral arrangements so important people won't have to look at you. Families don't reduce your work to a punchline. Families don't decide your husband is beneath them because he doesn't advertise himself properly." My mother's eyes filled with tears then, but even that didn't move me the way it once would have. I was too tired of being manipulated by performances of regret that only appeared when there was an audience. "Nora, please," she whispered. "We didn't mean." "Yes," I said, cutting her off with a calmness that surprised me. "You did. Maybe not every word in exactly the way it landed, but yes, you meant it. You have meant it for years." I took a breath and let myself look around the room one last time at the donors, investors, reporters, social climbers, all of them staring with the expression people wear when a polished illusion cracks open in front of them. "So let me make this simple," I said. "From this point forward, if you want me in your life, respect is the minimum requirement. Not money, not image, not whether my husband impresses the right people. Respect for my work, my marriage, and my boundaries. If you can't do that, then being related to me won't buy you access to me." Then I handed the microphone back to Ezra, reached for his hand, and together we walked off the stage while the entire room watched the daughter they had dismissed leave with more dignity than anyone still standing under those chandeliers. The fallout began before we even got to the car. My phone was buzzing by the time Ezra and I reached the lobby, but I didn't check it. I couldn't. My whole body felt like it was running on adrenaline and grief and some strange new kind of relief. Outside, the night air hit my face, and I finally exhaled like I had been holding my breath for years. We got into the car, and for the first few minutes, neither of us spoke. Ezra drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting open between us, and eventually I took it. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. I stared out at the lights of the city sliding past the window and tried to find an answer that felt honest. "I don't know," I said. "I feel like I just tore down a house I spent my whole life trying to live in." He squeezed my hand. Maybe it was never a home. That broke something loose in me, and I cried harder than I had in years. Not because I regretted what happened, but because I didn't. Because underneath all the shock and hurt, there was relief. The next morning confirmed everything. My mother had left 8 voicemails. Vincent had sent 2 stiff messages asking for a conversation, and Griffin had texted, "You humiliated all of us." I stared at that line for a long moment before typing back, "No, I stopped letting you do it to me." Then I turned off my phone and sat with the silence. Over the following weeks, word spread through every circle my family cared about. The gala became a story people told in lowered voices over lunch and drinks, not because of Ezra's success, but because of the cruelty everyone had witnessed once it could no longer hide behind manners. A hospital donor reached out to me directly about the Meridian Grid initiative. 2 of Vincent's business contacts quietly backed away. Griffin's fiancée stopped posting about the wedding for a while, which I knew meant panic in their world. And for the first time, none of it felt like my responsibility to manage. 6 weeks later, I met my mother and Vincent at a small coffee shop, on my terms, in daylight, with no stage and no audience. They looked older, smaller. My mother cried. Vincent apologized without trying to spin it. I listened, but I didn't rush to comfort them. I told them the truth, that I was willing to leave the door open, but only if they understood that love without respect was just control wearing softer clothes. When I got home that evening, Ezra was waiting for me on the porch with takeout and 2 glasses of wine. He looked up as I sat beside him and asked, "How do you feel?" I leaned back, listened to the evening settle around us, and realized that for the first time in my life, the answer came without hesitation. "Free," I said. And I meant it. Not because my family had finally seen my worth, but because I had. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end of this story. If it touched you in any way, please leave a comment below and let me know what you thought. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you won't miss the next story. Your support truly means everything. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you again very soon in the next story.